My remit today then is to try and bring all this together and answer the big question, as André put it, is uniformity a dream? Well, the simple answer is yes. So I could sit down now, but I won't. I won't cheat you. Let's first think about this and think through the problem. When we talk about uniformity of competence, what are we talking about? And we've heard from my fellow panelists today there are three aspects of competence, or I certainly would say there are. The first is the positive dimension, the power of a tribunal to rule on its own jurisdiction. Now there, I would venture to say it is relatively uncontroversial to suggest that is now recognised internationally. So perhaps we do have uniformity in at least that aspect of competence. But then we move to the negative dimension that we've heard about already. And there are two parts to that. The first is post-award competence. So we're in a situation where we've had the arbitration award, and that award comes before a national court, either in enforcement proceedings or set aside. In that situation, does competence, the negative dimension, preclude the court from reopening the decision on jurisdiction? And again there, while there may be some differences, there is broad uniformity, I would say, at least, for example, between France and England, which are typically pitched as two of the extreme ends of the spectrum, in that both will conduct a de novo review of the jurisdiction questions there. But then we turn to the pre-award scenario, the question of whether the courts can in some way intervene in the question of jurisdiction before the tribunal issues an award. And that is where we have heard much of the discussion today, and that is where there is a significant degree of divergence. So we'll have a think about that now. So in terms of that, and just to posit one example for the purposes of my presentation, we've heard from Dario about the approach in France and Portugal, and Dario pitched France as being the extreme end of the spectrum, which I would agree with. The idea there that if you have court proceedings started in France in relation to a matter, and the other party contends that is covered by an arbitration agreement, if a tribunal has been formed and is seized of that dispute, the French courts will decline jurisdiction. And similarly, even if there is no tribunal, they will take a prima facie review, but there is a significant deference towards the tribunal. If we compare that to the situation in England, the position is different. And I don't want to go into too much detail now, given time and given it's not my remit to talk about England, but in short, the English court will look at this question fully. It will be for the party seeking to resist the court proceedings to show that there is an arbitration agreement that covers the matters in dispute. It's not enough to show there's an arguable case. It must show that the agreement covers it. And then if it can do that, the balance slips to the other party, the one seeking to bring the court proceedings, to show that the agreement is null and void, and wording along those lines. And there it's not sufficient, again, for that party to show an arguable case. It must, again, establish its case. But the interesting distinction here is that there is a court discretion as to whether to allow a full trial of these issues before it reaches its decision, or whether it can decide these points without a full trial. And that's a significant divergence. The question there is you may end up in England in a full trial on these issues of jurisdiction. So that's the divergence. If we're going to think about the question of uniformity and whether it's a dream, we need to try and do some thinking about, well, why do we have this degree of divergence between different jurisdictions? And I'm not going to pretend I've undertaken a scientific study of this, and I'm sure others will have ideas in the audience and on our panel. But let me pose a few hypotheses, a few theories to get us going. Interestingly, it's not a common law, civil law divide here. Dario mentioned that Germany adopts a similar approach to England, for example. Singapore goes the other way and adopts not as far along the road as France, but along that side of the spectrum. So that's not our explanation. One potentially obvious explanation is that the international instruments that we're all familiar with that govern arbitration internationally often create consensus. The New York Convention, the Arbitration Model Law, do not prescribe the standard of review by courts in this situation. They say, for example, that the arbitration agreement will be enforced unless the court finds that the agreement is null, void, inoperative, or incapable of being performed. That's the New York Convention. They don't say what standard the court should apply in reaching that decision. That seems superficially attractive. But then there are lots of other issues which are not set in stone in the New York Convention or on the model law on which there is perhaps a broad consensus in the international community. And I mentioned, for example, earlier that at the stage of enforcement now, it's accepted that there will be a de novo review of jurisdiction. So in that case then, why do approaches to competence competence at this pre-award stage differ so widely? And that, I would submit, is down to the fact they reflect fundamental differences in policy. In essence, legislators and courts are dealing here with broader questions of what should be prioritised. Should you prioritise judicial scrutiny at a pre-award stage so that a party is not forced to arbitrate without its consent? Or to allow any issue of jurisdiction arbitrability to be resolved at an early stage, rather than have to incur the expense of an arbitration only then for a court to disagree with the tribunal? Or, as a matter of policy, should the courts adopt a deferential approach? So avoiding the use, as Dario mentioned, a party being able to use parallel court proceedings to delay arbitration. So I would say that where we have come out on these issues in the different jurisdictions around the world is a different view and approach to those questions of policy, not an accident of evolution. And at the risk of painting this with a broad brush, we can see that, for example, if you look through various other aspects of English law, then English courts and law see a greater role for coordination between the national courts and arbitration tribunals, in the sense of supporting, English courts supporting arbitration, whereas perhaps the French approach is to look at arbitration as being more autonomous, standing alone. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that either one of these approaches is better or that one is more arbitration friendly than the other. That's not what I'm here to do today. But I do think it's important that we recognise when we come to the $60 million question, is uniformity a dream, that the basis of the divergence we have now. So then let's look at that. Is uniformity a dream? Well, what would it require? I would say is the first question we need to ask ourselves in considering this. Could, if we think that the divergence here in national approaches is because the international instruments, the New York Convention, are silent on these issues, could we achieve uniformity by changing those instruments? There has been discussion in the past, for example, in the context of the model law, that rather than saying that a court may refuse to refer a case to arbitration if it finds the arbitration agreement to be null and void, that's the actual wording, should it read manifestly null and void? So changing the standard of review. Some of you may remember that Professor Jan van den Berg, back in 2008, on the 50th anniversary of the New York Convention, posited the question, well, is it time for a new New York Convention? And in the draft he produced then, one of the suggestions he made was that there is a change to this standard of review. It does specify that the approach of a national court should adopt a prima facie basis to assessing whether there is an arbitration agreement. So if we did that, well, would then we achieve uniformity? Well, arguably, maybe. What are the prospects of achieving that? Well, in my submission, zero. And that was, I think, a significant reaction, if we think back, for those of you who do remember it, to Professor van den Berg's idea was, well, yes, we can talk about it, but what's the chance of getting 161 countries, as we are now in the New York Convention, to sign a new New York Convention? And is that something, as the international arbitration community, we are prepared to undertake as an exercise, given the risk we could make it worse? Similarly, with the model law, even if the model law is changed, well, that wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have then everyone, countries adopting that model law in its new form. And again, you certainly wouldn't achieve uniformity across the globe. So let's put that idea to one side, at least until anyone disagrees with me in the questions. Can we achieve uniformity without a seismic change to the New York Convention, for example, Is there a chance that things will edge closer together gradually through evolution? And again, there, my submission is that that is highly unlikely. If you accept my hypothesis that these differences come down to fundamental changes in policy and attitude, it seems unlikely they will change. And it's also important to keep in mind how entrenched these beliefs are in case law, in national law, in practitioners and judges' mindsets and approaches in the countries. So I would posit that there's no realistic prospect of harmonization through natural evolution alternatively. So then, yes, I would say that uniformity is a dream. But is that a problem? Is that something we should be dreaming about in the first place? Well, of course there's value in uniformity. We recognize for counsel, for users, that there is value in certainty and knowing what will happen if someone initiates parallel proceedings. So yes, there is generally certainty, greater harmonization approach is a good thing for international arbitration. And we see that in many of the other conventions and other practices in arbitration that we see slowly being harmonized. But is it really a significant problem in practice, this divergence in approach to pre-award competence? And I would be certainly keen to hear people's views on this later. But if I look at a few angles towards it now. First of all, can this uncertainty, can the problems be mitigated by a sensible choice of arbitration seat? That's one of the solutions we often pose to people. Yes, you have these quirky decisions, but you don't have to be exposed to those. You can make sure you choose your arbitration seat sensibly, and then it will be fine. But that doesn't really work here, because you can have your seat wherever you like. Then the question of where the other party starts its court proceedings isn't a matter of the seat. And unless you're in a world where the courts of your seat will grant an anti-suit injunction restraining foreign court proceedings, then the courts of the seat will not help you. But then I would ask, what mischief are we seeking to address through uniformity? Because when a dispute touches on more than one country, as is so common in the world of international arbitration, well then there's always potential for parallel proceedings and variances in approach. And that could be regarded as an inevitable consequence of international trade and international investment. And competence is just one element of that. There are plenty of others. Take, for example, the availability of discovery or document production in aid of foreign arbitration, 1782 in the US and the approach adopted elsewhere there. So it isn't on its own. And thirdly, even if there is uniformity in principle in approach, that certainly does not guarantee uniformity in outcome. And the Dalla case, the infamous Dalla case, is an excellent example of that. I will keep this brief because I'm sure I'm running short of time. But Dalla, very simply, Dalla against Pakistan, Dalla prevails in the arbitration which is seated in Paris. Dalla seeks to enforce, first of all, in London. And in London, the court looks at the question of jurisdiction de novo. Pakistan says, I was not party to the arbitration agreement. They look at that question de novo. And what Lord Mance said in that case, he said, the court may give limited prima facie credit to apparently valid arbitration awards. But then he goes on to say and concludes his quote, Dalla starts with the advantage of service. It does not also start 15 or 30 love up. That's the English court approach. They look at it de novo, they apply principles of French law, and they find that, in fact, Pakistan was not party to the arbitration agreement and declined to enforce. Dalla also starts proceedings in France, and Pakistan seeks to set aside the award. The French courts also look at the question de novo. They also apply principles of French law, and they find that Pakistan was party to the arbitration agreement and so uphold the award. So we have a similar approach to the question of competence there, but divergent outcomes. And finally, the fact that we're still talking about Dalla 7 to 8 years later, perhaps I would say illustrates that it was an exceptional case. And it would be interesting to hear how often these issues come up in practice. So just to sum up very briefly, while it's difficult to argue, and I would not argue, that it wouldn't be helpful in terms of certainty to have uniformity of approach, this isn't the only area in which seats of arbitration that would otherwise be considered perfectly pro-arbitration differ. And it's inevitable that there will be differences between jurisdictions. And as we've seen, even uniformity in approach does not guarantee uniformity of outcome. So yes, in my view, uniformity is a dream. I suspect that if we try to agree in this room which approach is best, we wouldn't find a resolution that everyone could sign up for. So the proposition that we would do that more broadly, again, I would say is more difficult. But finally, I would not suggest it as a dream that is worth us chasing as an international arbitration community. There are plenty of other things that we can improve, but I would submit our energy would be better spent. Thank you.